Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and today we're going to talk about Holy Paladin Phase 5 BiS. This is going to be for the AQ40 patch, so AQ40, AQ20, and everything came before it, just like the best items up until that point, from any source, PvP, raid, 20 man, etc. Right, and before we get into things, I'm going to talk a little bit about my philosophy for how I'm going to rank the gear. And then as we're ranking some of the gear, I'm also going to talk about some of the alternative choices, because for Paladin, I feel like there's more options than, or not quite as many options rather, as some of the other classes, so it might be easy to kind of hit on them in this video. And if it seems like there's going to be too many, we'll just kind of make it a separate video, but I think we'll be able to cover most things. So we'll just hop into it, and I want to start with the philosophy first. So on Paladin, especially if you're full consuming, right? So if you've got a flask on, which I think we do here. Actually, I don't. We'll put everything on. You might as well put a flask on as well. Is this not where you put flask on? Am I confused? Oh, here it is. And it says flask, XD. So yeah, you now have basically everything on. We're not going to put Moonkin Aura on because it's just not that common. But we'll go back to our setup. You can see that we have 10k mana. So even without the flask on, we had like 8k mana, which is fine. You don't really need to use a flask in most cases, but especially if you have a flask, you've got all your mana regeneration consumes, right? You've got Mage Blood. You don't even need the Cerebral Cortex. You can actually use the Speed Zanza if you want, but you could use this if you wanted. You have the 30% crit. It's going to take a lot to get you on this Paladin, especially if you're using Major Manas on cooldown, as well as using Dark Runes on cooldown. Okay, so what that means is that we really don't value regen very highly, because there's going to be very few cases that we need it. And even in the cases where you would think you would need regen, for example, like Molten Core and AQ tend to be prime examples of where you want regen on most healing classes, right? Why? Because like they're very long, winding instances. You can pull a lot of things together in the instances. You can kind of keep moving. There's not a lot of things you have to necessarily set up for. Although some of the later packs in AQ that applies to, but especially not so much in the earlier packs. Maybe some things, so you have to mark some things, but it's relatively easy, right? You can kind of W key through a lot of the stuff, even as a mostly average guild, which means that, you know, for a class like a priest or a druid, MP5 is really great in those instances, and it's also great in Nax too, because Nax is just huge, right? But it's not as good as in an instance like Blackwing Lair, because there's kind of a lot of like, oh, we're going to group up here and then go for a little bit, you know, and then group up. So you're going to have time to remax your mana. You're not going to have that MP5 ticking throughout the whole raid like it might be in AQ or Molten Core. And this even applies to Paladin to some degree in those instances, right? You know, that's where the difference in having maybe like a green pair of pants that's like 60-some healing, right? And having a pair of pants that's like Salamander Scale, where it's like, well, maybe only 53 healing or 51 healing, I forget what it is, but you have the extra 9 mana per 5 there, right? So that's where that mana per 5 really starts to tick in, but it's going to be very rare circumstances where it's going to come down to that if you're using all the consumes, because, you know, with your mana regen from Illumination, from the crit, and then on top of that, your kind of base MP5 just from this setup here, using all the consumes, then using the mana consumes on top of that, it's going to be very rare that you're actually running out of mana, right? Especially because you will be able to find some spots to get a drink in here and there usually without actually losing any uptime on healing. In your average guild at least, it's not straight W keying. So that means that we care about plus healing a lot on Paladin, because the kind of the whole idea is we want to make our Flash of Light the most viable heal possible. If you have 0 healing on a Paladin, Flash of Light doesn't really do a ton, right? And you're really kind of capped by that in terms of your ceiling. So you want to add as much plus healing as possible onto Flash of Light to make it as strong as possible, to basically increase your throughput and your ceiling and allow you to just, it's pretty mana efficient heal as well, right? Compared to Holy Light. So and it's also like way harder to do overhealing with it, which makes it like fantastic at being an efficient heal. So what that means is that, you know, you want to be spamming this almost all the time. I'm going to make a how to play Paladin video where we kind of get more into the weeds of like when you should be using different spells. But you basically want to be using Flash of Light a lot, and we really want to make this as strong as possible. So even though it only has a 0.42 spell coefficient, we're still dumping basically every last point of plus healing we can, because it doesn't really matter about our regen in most cases, right? And there's going to be some caveats, and we will talk about those when we get to them. So we'll start off with the helmet here, right? There's some interesting choices across the board. Now, I think technically the best option here is the Deviate Helm. I mean, this thing is just insane, right? The 8 mana per 5. It's basically the same item as the Lost Hat here, but with 1% crit, which is obviously really good for Paladin, and that probably more than makes up for the little bit of MP5 lost. Problem is it comes off a world boss, right? So unless you have access to world bosses, you're probably not getting this. So realistically, you're pretty much left with the Lost Hat here. The Crystal Adorned Crown is actually very good in its own right, but again, it comes off the world boss, right? I honestly would probably use... I might use the Adorned Crown over the Deviate Cap. Maybe not, actually. I think the complete stat package on the Deviate Cap, I would use it over the Crown. Typically, I rate like 1 crit to be around 20-ish healing. And I could do a video where I kind of derive that for you and explain why I rate it around that. That's in terms of like throughput. It doesn't really take into account the mana back you get from crit, right? So that's an extra incentive to potentially build crit over healing. So for example, if you had an item that's like 60 healing and an item that's 80 healing, and the item that's 60 healing also had a % crit, I might take that item because the crit is going to maybe average out to around 20 healing-ish or so, based on the calculations that I did. And then you're also getting the mana back when that crit does happen, right? So I'll make a separate video where we get into the weeds on that. But all these options are strong, but this is probably the one you're going to end up getting for BiS in most cases, right? This item is decent, right? But it's not really that much better than the Zilean Headdress. So, you know, don't worry about that too much. Luckily, items like the Zilean Headdress work very well on the Paladin because you typically don't need the extra regen, right? This is just kind of like for pure BiS, which means that an item like the Lost Hat here is going to be one of the last things you target, right? You don't really want to be using a lot of item priority on mostly mana per 5. So keep that in mind, right? Going to the next slot here, the best amulet is the Amulet of the Fallen God. This drops from the Cthulhu, drops an eye, you turn it in, you get this. But, you know, it's somewhat competitive to get this drop, and it might cost you some level of prio. So I would just recommend that you pick up the Amulet of the Shifting Sands from AQ20. It's from the last boss of AQ20. It's kind of the same thing. His head drops, you turn it in, you can pick one of these items. So I would just take this and be more than happy with that. It is kind of a situation, like I said before, where you do want every bit of plus healing, but this is still something I would focus on dead last because you're only getting, you know, like 10 extra healing out of this, really, right? These items are also fine, but, you know, they just don't really compare, especially to this amulet with how easy it is to get. So I wouldn't really focus very much on getting those. Coming into the shoulder slot, basically the Wild Growth Spalders still holding it down from Molten Core as being one of the best items. This is like an item I would recommend to people get early on a Paladin if they can, because it's just very good. You'll notice actually that if you don't have this item, right, the ZG equivalent item here, the Animalist Spalders, are very close to basically everything else. So, you know, if you have this upgrading to this mantle, not that great. Upgrading to this mantle, you know, not really that great. So really, this is the best in class item, and getting this is kind of huge. Yeah, just not much else to say about that. If you can't get it, then pretty much the Animalist Spalders here are going to suit you just fine, and I wouldn't really waste prio on these unless they're completely free. Going to the Cloak, this is one where Hide of the Wild works basically just as well as the BiS Cloak. You can see there's technically a little bit more healing on Hide of the Wild here, we're not going to be so crazy that we're going to say that the 2 extra healing outweighs the 8 mana per 5 on this, because when you do get into those situations where you need mana, the 8 MP5 is really clutch, right? So I would absolutely use this all day over Height of the Wild, but again, it's just not a concern for me, right? I'm not trying to get this item really early on Paladin when I can just easily have Height of the Wild as an alternative. Something interesting, though, that I want to mention about MP5 before we continue, and I think this item like shows it very clearly, right? The value of MP5 on Paladin, it's a double-edged sword in a way, really, because like I mentioned, most of the time you're not going to use it, right? So when you're not using it, it's just completely ineffective. Like, you have more mana than you know what to do with, right? But in the cases where you are going to go for whatever unforeseen catastrophe, is lying in front of you, right? The mana per 5 actually does a lot of work, because basically your heals are so efficient, and the fact that you can actually get enough mana for 1 additional heal, and especially if you're fully world buffed, right? You have all your buffs, you have like 30% crit, you have a 1 in 3 chance of basically just renewing your mana source, right? So you can take that 1 in 3 incredibly far. So having these little bits of extra MP5, while they're not necessary in most situations, they definitely are good in those, those emergency situations. They actually perform better for you than they do for other classes, because you can get way more out of a small amount of mana than a priest can. Like, if you, let's say that there's like a bad pull or something like that, you haven't been able to drink on 2 classes, okay? And on priests, the cumulative amount of MP5 that you have on your character has net you like 400 extra mana for this like long pull or something, we'll just say, right? Something like that. And or maybe a bit more, but just make up a number, any number, right? Maybe we'll actually be generous. Let's say it's like 1,000, okay? On a priest, you can go through 1,000 mana in basically 3 max flash heal casts, right? You can downrank the flash heal and get more out of them. You can, or maybe you have to use a shield to save somebody. You have to use a bunch of your mana. So it's great that you had the MP5 there to get you the extra mana, but you go through that mana very fast. On Paladin, that 1,000 mana, if you're casting 150 mana Flash of Light, you can make that go so far, because basically every third heal or more than that, you're getting your full mana refunded back. You're also regenerating throughout the entire time, and you're regenerating to cast a heal that costs less mana on average than what the priest is going to have to cast, okay? So I just want to make this point about MP5, that it's definitely not useless. It's just not your first priority. But if you can get items like Cloak of Clarity, this is actually like a huge buff to your effectiveness in those potentially sketchy situations, right? If you have items like Cloak of Clarity, and then you have some other items with MP5, like let's say you have these gloves instead of something like these gloves right here, right? You have the Peacekeepers instead of Wasp Hide, so you have 4 MP5 from this, and you keep getting MP5 from these like these other sources, right? You can actually make a huge difference in your effectiveness in the raid when things go bad, right? Or during like a super mana intense speedrun. So it's just something to keep in mind. These items are not bad for Paladin. It's just they're not the priority. Same thing goes with Robe of the Guardian Saint, right? And I actually want to make a point about intellect on this item, right? Because not only does this item have the additional 7 mana per 5, but it has the 22 intellect, right? So normally you're using like a, let's say a Robes of the Exalted or a Red Dragon Scale Breastplate, and in those cases you basically have very little stats, okay? So not only are you getting the 7 mana per 5 when you equip this, but the 22 intellect kind of goes a long way, because if you were to ever hit that rock bottom, right, where you couldn't cast any more spells, the 22 intellect is giving you a good chunk more mana. You can cast 2 or 3 more spells easy, and you can parlay those spells via the crit mechanic into even more casts. And as you're casting, right, you're getting your regen still, right, from your other mana per 5, and then maybe a Dark Rune cooldown comes up, maybe a potion cooldown comes up. So you can see how all of these little mana advantages on Paladin can actually be super useful in the clutch, because Paladin is just so mana efficient to begin with that when you do get these little boosts to mana or mana regen, it's so much more effective on Paladin than it is on any other class. It's just that most of the time you don't actually need it. So Robes of the Guardian Saint, again, it's a fantastic item, but it's just not going to be a priority item for you right away because you have other things, right, that you want. Royal Bracelets of Redemption, these are pretty good. I'm on my Paladin looking forward to these because I'm using a green healing item right now, so it's literally just 33 plus healing, so I don't even have the int from something like Gillant's Wrist Guards. And the reason is basically it's just hard to find groups for things like Dire Maul North. So that means that a lot of people are using green bracelets, and getting the extra 20 healing on this item plus the intellect and the stamina, that's a pretty good bonus for AQ 40, right? For a single item AQ 40. So this is definitely going to be on my list of things to try and grab at some point. Might not be the highest priority, but it'll definitely be up there. Going into the weapon here, the Scepter, just unequivocally the best. Obviously, there's not really much else you can say. It's just by far the best item you could get for one hand in this. There's not really anything else you want to use, right? The next best option is Grand Marshals. Then it's pretty much the Femur, but you're never going to get that. And so Locomir is kind of the next option after that. And then Jindu's. There's this, but it's a two-hand. So yeah, really, this is a thing you want to try and get on Paladin. It's just absolutely insane. But everybody else is going to be trying to get it too. So good luck. And that's the weapon slot. We're going to come back to the Offhand at the end because I want to talk a little bit about that specifically. The Peacekeeper Gauntlet, so these I really recommend trying to get because, they're just not that bad of a drop from Hakar. They're not super rare, they're not super common, but there's a low amount of Paladins. Typically there's only going to be one other Paladin in your ZG, right? So it should be really easy to get these if you just put the time in and keep running ZGs. And they're pretty much the best Paladin gauntlets in the game. I think they're even better than the Naxx ones as an individual item. So yeah, they pretty much have everything you want. They have really good plus healing and a little bit of MP5. They're just way better than any of the other options here. Going into the belt. The belt is again one of those items. This is a really strong amount of MP5 here, but it actually is less healing and basically the same amount of intellect as something like Corehound Belt. So there's really no reason or need to, kind of go crazy about trying to upgrade to Grasp of the Old God. I would absolutely just keep my Corehound Belts and be very happy with that, right? Going into the leg slot here. Now the leg slot is kind of nice. These are still going to be your BiS legs, in my opinion, because they just have 10 more healing on them, basically, than the leg plates of Blazing Light. But the leg plates of Blazing Light are fantastic in the sense that they are plate, and they're another alternative drop option. And there's going to be less loot competition on them, right, because they are plate. So the other healing classes basically can't use them. So, don't feel bad about picking up these in place of these. They're basically the same thing, right? And you even get like a little bit more intellect and stuff. So I would be totally happy getting these, and I wouldn't really fret about not being able to get empowered leggings. Salamander scale pants are definitely inferior to these other two options, in my opinion. In most cases, obviously they'll be a little bit better in those emergency situations, but 9 MP5 on the whole kit is not really that much of a big deal, right? So I would definitely prefer one of these over Salamander Scale, but there's still an option that you can potentially go for, right? I right now don't have any of these, so I'm just using green 64 healing pants. I think they go up to 66 at the highest, but yeah. So fantastic legs here, and a great alternative option in AQ that you can get. Boots of Pure Thought, just by far the best boots. Not really much to say about it. I mean, they're just by far the best. So you want to try and definitely get those. these options are pretty decent, right? If you don't have something else. The Peacekeepers are actually quite nice. So if I had a choice between the Peacekeepers and these, I might go with these treads, but I think honestly, realistically, I would use the Peacekeepers just for the 6 additional MP5, because again, in those clutch situations where you really do need mana, or let's say you lose world buffs, that's where the MP5 really starts to become more effective, right? So yeah, I would definitely consider using those if you can't get Boots of Pure Thought. And moving on to the ring slot, right? So the ring slot, there's really not a lot of debate here, right? Because again, we really just want the maximum amount of plus healing possible, which means we're basically going to be using a Pure Elementium band, and probably going to want a Ring of the Martyr for the MP5, because there's no point in using a Cauterizing band. Well, you could use a Cauterizing band in place of a Pure Elementium band and then get a Ring of the Martyr. You're losing a little bit of healing, right? But you don't really benefit much from the Spirit on Pure Elementium anyway, so it's not like a huge loss. But that's the ring slot. Currently, I'm using the ZG rings. These are probably going to be the last thing to upgrade for me, because they tend to be a little bit of a pain. But yeah, I mean, these are by far the best rings you can go. On Paladin, you really don't want to be using the Bronze Dragonflight sigil or signet, because it's just really not it's really not that great, right? You're looking to maximize plus healing every opportunity, and this just doesn't do that. So yeah. Coming into trinkets, rejuvenation gem, by far the best trinket you can have. The Scarab Brooch on this class is, in my opinion, not as good as on other classes, because the heals you're going to be casting have they don't have quite as high of a value. However, the interesting thing about it is that you don't really have a lot of alternative trinket options, right? You basically have stuff like Briarwood Reed. I'm currently using the Seal here. I don't have a Read Your Gem, so I'm using the Seal in the Heart of Hakar full time. Heart of Hakar is an excellent trinket, but again, it does go on cooldown. So one thing I would recommend that you might do is you could pick up like a Heart of the Hakar and then a Scarab Brooch here, right? And you would just cycle them, essentially. I think that would be a pretty good way to get some extra value out of that slot, and it would probably be better, almost certainly, as long as you're doing the swapping correctly, than using like the 20 healing DM trinket, right? So just something to keep in mind there, that you absolutely can do that if you want. Until you can get stuff like that, I basically just use the DM trinket. If you are in a guild where you think things are going to go bad, right? Or you're kind of coming up to a section of the run that notoriously is stressful on your mana, if you do have a trinket like Mind Tap or Shard of Scale, they're not like a terrible trinket to use necessarily, right? So you could use something like that. Honestly, you could even use something like a Darkmood card Blue if you have it, if you have really bad trinket options. And what you would do then is you would just kind of play to your spirit a bit more. So maybe you would use the Spirit Zanza to get plus 50 spirit, okay? And then, you would just like focus on getting a bit more spirit than normal in order to basically make the Darkmoon card a little bit more effective. But again, I wouldn't really worry about that too much. I would really probably just use the Royal Seal. Coming into the last item here, the Libram. So this is newly added for Phase 5. It's going to be a pain to get because nobody wants to run Skullo, but you should really try and get it if you can, because it's just 50-some additional healing on your flashlight. I mean, it's basically like the biggest upgrade you're going to get to your flash. So, yeah, it's outside of like the actual weapon itself. So just something to pick up there. And, there's a new healing enchant, plus 30 healing. We are using healing on everything, so we're not using... you'll see on my priest videos I have the MP5 enchant here. We're not doing that on Paladin. Again, we're trying every last point of healing counts, right? So we're using the 24 healing enchant on the bracers. And let's talk about the Offhand, right? Because this is kind of the most interesting thing. So the Offhand, the best one possible here is Satura's Might. has a little bit of everything. It has the intellect, the healing, and the mana for 5. It's just strictly better than something like the Lay of the Life Giver here, right? It basically beats it, just has a little bit less healing, but it beats it in every other way. So technically this would be best in slot. Now, I would never spend any amount of soft res or prio on this unless it was literally the last item I needed in the run. Okay, this is just like a terrible item for Paladin, in my opinion, to use prio on when you can so easily get the lay from Alterac Valley. And the only other interesting option I feel like is the Wormscale Buckler, and this is it's kind of like the same thing in Blackwing Lair. You had a very similar predicament where you could always get the red Dragon Scale Protector, and it kind of served the same purpose. Now, I want to show you something kind of drastic here, right? Where if we take this off, okay, and we put the lay on, let's say, we go down to 1700 armor, which is 24% mitigation. Now, if we add the devotion aura on, because let's say, you know, we're not going to need to have a different aura on every time, especially during AQ, because there's no nature aura on Paladin. We boost this up a little bit. We go to 2482, 31% damage reduction, right? Now, let's swap in a shield and see what happens. Let's swap in the Wormscale Buckler, okay? Okay. So we go to 5.5k armor, 50% mitigation. That is absolutely insane, okay? And we actually get to put an enchant on this offhand, which can be stamina is probably what you're going to do in most cases, but, you know, for Nax, you could use frost resistance, right? So a little bit more health on top of that, and just an insane amount of mitigation. Now, if I had this item, I would pretty much always use it in most cases. Okay, now there might be some particular fights, if I'm remembering properly, I'll swap it out, right, where there's basically no chance I have a chance of being hit or something like that. It is like in the weapon slot, so you can kind of do that easier, but in most cases, I'm just running with this. If I'm in Molten Core especially, I'm running with this. If I'm in a 20-man, I'm running with this. For anything that can, like, you know, has trash that can just quickly come on to me, like a Surger or something like that, I'm always using this. I'm protecting myself way more. We haven't even factored in the block. The block isn't like the most useful thing in the world, but it is doing something, right? It's mostly the armor here. But I would always use an armor shield over an offhand in a lot of situations where it's basically possible for you to die. There's going to be a lot of fights like that. A lot of trash in Nax does some heavy damage, heavy physical damage, right? And a lot of these things you can avoid, you know, but having that extra buffer is way more worth the extra, like, 15 or so healing on the item. It's not even close to me. So this item is a worthwhile investment. One thing that I will say is if you already have the shield from Blackwing Lair, right, I wouldn't freak out about trying to upgrade it to this, because you're only gaining the 6 MP5, really. The healing value is the same. You're gaining a little bit more armor, but you know, you basically have the big chunk of armor that you need at that point. If you can see, going between this shield and the red Dragon Scale Protector, you're not really losing that much armor, right? So realistically, either of these options kind of work, but I really like having a strong armor shield as part of my repertoire on Paladin, and I will absolutely use either the Worm Scale or the Dragon Scale over something like the Lay of the Life Giver, especially. So just wanted to make one final point about that. And I think that is basically everything. I think we kind of went through all the alternatives and everything like that. Paladin's just really easy. It's relatively straightforward. Just get the most amount of healing you can and blast, right? So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this helped. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe if it did, and I will talk to you guys next time.